You could throw your own surprise party at that point. All right, take your Bibles. Let's go to Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. Last week we got started on this chapter, and so we're going to try to wrap this up this week. Just to kind of hit the ground running and remember what's been happening. The chapter opened with Belshazzar, who is the king of Babylon. Remember, he's kind of a co-king. Nabonidus is his father is the actual king, and Nabonidus is the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, and so Belshazzar is a grandson. He's going to refer to him, remember, in this passage as his father, but that's just a way of referring to an ancestor, an immediate ancestor. And so this is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He is now ruling and reigning in Babylon. Nabonidus has been out fighting, and we'll find out in this chapter, losing to the Persians and to the Medes. And while this chapter is going on, the Medes and the Persians have actually surrounded the city of Babylon and are planning their invasion of the city itself. And that may have been the incident specifically that provokes Belshazzar to throw this big feast. He's feeling very secure. The city of Babylon is pretty much impregnable. It's surrounded by a moat. It's got a river that runs through it. There's walls that are 40 foot high all around it. There's really, he feels like no way anybody can get in. But there is some troubling things going on. There's these pesky prophecies that maybe even people have been reminding him of, that the Jews brought with them from Palestine when they were in captivity, that 150 years previously, Isaiah had prophesied that the kingdom of Babylon would fall to a man by the name of Cyrus. Well, guess who the king is that's leading the Persians? That there's this reminder that God had given Nebuchadnezzar, that the Babylonian Empire would come to a conclusion and would be succeeded by another empire. And all of these things are kind of making, I think, Belshazzar a little nervous. So he throws this big party to kind of shore things up, to remind his people that things are safe. And then he takes it a step further. As part of this festivities, as part of the feast, he specifically, we said, singled out the artifacts from the temple back in Jerusalem. Maybe it's superstition trying to weaken the God of Israel by defiling these temple treasures. Maybe it's just quite nothing more than thumbing his nose at God, saying, I don't care what your holy books say. I don't care what your prophets have to say. You can't touch me. And in the midst of that party, a hand appears and begins writing on the wall, and it just scares everybody. It's obviously some supernatural action, something that some God is doing, but they can't make any sense out of what's been written. They don't understand it. He calls in the astrologers and he calls in the magicians, and just like his grandfather had done when he was confused by things, and just like his grandfather found out, they couldn't do anything. They could see the writing, but they can't make any sense of it. They don't know what it is. Don't know what it means. And so at the end of last week's lesson, we saw the queen mother, maybe even Nebuchadnezzar's wife, maybe Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, the mother of Belshazzar, but a person who evidently knows about Daniel and knows who Daniel was and what Daniel had done. And she comes in and tells Belshazzar, you need to talk to Daniel. You need to bring Daniel in. He can help you with this. And that's kind of where we left it last week. So we're going to pick it up in chapter 5, verse 13, with Daniel now interpreting this writing. Verse 13 says, Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, that art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king, my father, brought out of Jewry? Kind of interesting that this is, Belshazzar's last resort, right? He had already called for the magicians and the soothsayers and the wise men, and they couldn't help him. But as a last resort, well, okay, I'll call in Daniel. How often is that the case, that somebody exhausts every other resource they have and finally they turn to God? Maybe in this case, we'll see in just a moment, too late. But he does verify. He shows that personally he's not very familiar with Daniel. That's probably been intentional. Remember, there have been a few kings between Nebuchadnezzar and this, and so Daniel's influence that he had with Nebuchadnezzar and the position and the respect that he had for Nebuchadnezzar has been pretty diminished. Daniel's also up in years now. He's about 80 years old now, so he's basically in retirement. So Belshazzar doesn't really seem to have a personal familiarity with Daniel, but we're going to see as this passage unfolds, he knew better. I think he knows more than he's letting on here. When he's just trying to clarify, are you Daniel? Are you the one that that came from Judah. Maybe he's also just making sure he's dealing with the right person here. If he's got suspicions that the God of Israel that he has offended, maybe he needs to make sure that, well, this is somebody who knows that God, somebody who speaks on his behalf. So but it at least shows it's been a while since Daniel has been summoned, since anybody has sought to see what Daniel and his God have to say about the issues of Babylon. Verse 14, he says, I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. I'm not going to make a huge deal out of this, but I do think it's interesting if you look back at verse 14 when he says that the spirit of the gods is in thee. If you go back and look at previous verses and even look at what Nebuchadnezzar had said, there's a different way that they phrased it when they referred to it. They said the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. Belshazzar doesn't seem to have that same sort of understanding of the idea of the holiness of Daniel's God, but he's trying to butter Daniel up here. He needs something from him, so I understand that spirit and excellent wisdom is found in thee. Verse 15, now the wise men and the astrologers have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof. They could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations, and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Just again, pay attention to Belshazzar saying everything that he's heard. You have a reputation. I know about you. I've heard about you. Maybe in his mind just from the Queen Mother in the previous verses, but again, it's going to be ironic when Daniel's going to point out to him in a second. There's some other things you should have known. There's some other things you should have been aware of. Some other things that you should have remembered. Well, Belshazzar repeats the previous promised rewards for whoever would interpret the dream. So verse 17, Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known unto him the interpretation. Daniel makes it clear that his services are not for sale. I'm not doing this for a bribe. I'm not going to give you an interpretation that makes you happy or makes you look good just because you're paying me. He says, you keep your rewards. I'm not interested in promotion. I don't really have a whole lot of use for gold chains, and I don't know, maybe he's enjoying retirement at this point and saying, I don't want to be number third in the kingdom. I don't want to go back to work. He did that for a long time. But he says, I am going to be able to tell you what that says and what that means. Verse 18, O thou king, the most high God. Again, notice Daniel's distinction there. You said earlier, that I'm connected with the gods. Daniel says, it's more than that. The God that I am affiliated with, the God that I'm about to describe to you, the God that is speaking to you right now is the most high God. He gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew, and whom he would keep alive, and whom he would set up, and whom he would put down. In other words, he had all power. He had every ability. He was not limited, not hindered in his authority. But when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. As powerful as he was, as big and majestic, and as he could just issue whatever proclamation he wanted, Daniel says there was somebody higher than him. There was somebody that he's accountable to, the Most High God. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and dwelling was with the wild asses, and they fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. For all of Nebuchadnezzar's thinking he was all that in a slice of bread, that I could do what I want, I tell people, I give instructions, I give orders, I determine who lives and dies. Says Nebuchadnezzar learned a very important lesson. That God rules in the affairs of men. That God appoints whomever he will. And then verse 22. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. We'll come back and revisit that in just a moment. Just let that sink in. What Daniel just described here about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, this is not news to Belshazzar. You knew what had happened. You knew what Nebuchadnezzar went through. You knew the lesson Nebuchadnezzar had learned. Verse 23, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords and thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. Thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold and brass and iron and wood and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Before Daniel gives an interpretation of the vision that they've seen, before he interprets the writing on the wall, he gives a very harsh rebuke to this proud king. He goes over the events that we saw back in chapter 4 and reminds Belshazzar how Nebuchadnezzar had learned a lesson about pride and a lesson about the God of heaven. And in contrast, he says, Belshazzar, you have not humbled your heart. Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king ever, had humbled himself before God, Belshazzar. And you, not even close to as great. You're thumbing your nose at the Almighty. Thou knewest all of this, he said. So again, I remind you, Belshazzar should have known and surely knew about Nebuchadnezzar's illnesses. For a number of reasons. Remember, we're only 20 plus years removed from those events. Belshazzar was alive when those things happened. He was a part of the royal court. He was a grandson of the king, so could have had very personal, intimate knowledge of that. But even if you take that part back, remember Nebuchadnezzar, after those events transpired, issued a royal proclamation that was sent throughout the entire kingdom, telling everyone exactly what had happened. Everybody knew the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar had learned. This is not innocent ignorance. This is willful ignorance. And it makes his blasphemy of God even more repulsive. He knew full well what he was doing. When he sent for the temple treasures, he was actively, purposefully defying God. He knew what he was doing. He knew who he was targeting. And in his pride and his arrogance, shaking his fist at God, saying, you can't tell me what to do. I'm the king. I'm in charge. Belshazzar had done what he did, not in spite of what he knew, but because of what he knew. He purposefully desecrated God's vessels to demonstrate he's not intimidated by this God. He refused to humble himself. And according to Daniel, he should have known better. Famous last words, aren't they? How many lessons have we learned that after the fact we look back and said, I should have known better. I knew that was a bad decision. I knew I shouldn't have done that. I've known my whole life that was wrong. And we did it anyway. How many tragedies have we brought on ourselves because we should have known better? We like to pretend like, the issues and the circumstances that we find ourselves in, like, I'm just completely blindsided. Not as often as we like to imagine. I think most of the trials and tribulations that we look at that are a result of our actions, we look back and say, yeah, I should have known not to do that. I knew that was wrong when I said that. I knew that was wrong when I did that. And we need to recognize the consequences of those actions are very real and very avoidable. I think it's kind of interesting too. Look back at verse 23. Just make this connection. He said, when you lifted yourself up against the Lord God of heaven, he said, you've praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, of iron, stone. Do those words sound familiar? Remember the statue dream back in chapter 2? Head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly of brass, feet of iron, hit by a stone. I think even the gods that Belshazzar singled out to worship and to praise were in a sense kind of a blasphemous irony. That he's trying on purpose to say, yeah, I know what Nebuchadnezzar said. I know what dream Nebuchadnezzar had. And I'm just defying all of it. I'm going to praise the gods of all these things, these kingdoms that you say are going to conquer us. No. We got this. Belshazzar praised this pantheon of lifeless idols, but the living God, who says, I hold your very life in my hands. Your breath is in my hands. Belshazzar refused to honor him. What a rebuke. So verse 24, we come to the message. What message was God sending this proud, arrogant king? Verse 24 says, Then was part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this writing was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Let's kind of work through this, the message, and you can see from just the meanings of the words why this was maybe a little confusing to the wise men and the astrologers. These words written on the wall without any context, without any significance. You just looked on the wall and you saw numbered weighed dividings. It's like, okay, I don't know what that means. And they were confused by it, but Daniel understands exactly what this means. So he begins to interpret this for Belshazzar. Verse 26, he says, This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. He's telling the message here, the meaning, the significance of those words is that Babylon's kingdom is coming to an end. I think we've seen and mentioned this before in other contexts, but in both Hebrew and Aramaic, if you want to intensify a thought, you duplicate it. You repeat it for emphasis. We have superlatives that we use to make something, the greatest or the biggest of things. We use extra words. They just duplicate it. So if you had peace, shalom. Well, if you want that to be perfect peace, you say shalom, shalom. You can have something that's holy, kadosh, or if you want to say the holy of holies, the holiest place, it's kadosh, kadosh. And so you duplicate it. And so here, the duplication, the mene, mene, it's numbered. It's a certainty, it's a surety. And Daniel interprets that God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. About what happens when you count something. If we're to count the number of people in the room, we know exactly how many people are here. We number the people so we know the full extent of it. We know exactly the number when we count them. Well, God says, I know exactly how long the Babylonian kingdom is going to end, how long it's going to last. And I'm telling you, in the phrase we get from this, we have an idiom that we use for this, your days are numbered. You make that statement, you're like, listen, the date is on the calendar. We'll find out by the end of the chapter that date was a lot sooner than they expected. But, obviously they had to have some sort of inclination, because like I said, the city is surrounded by the Persian Empire at the moment. So the thing that Belshazzar was trying to avoid, being conquered by the Persians, God says, listen, I've already said it's going to happen, and you're running out of time. I've already determined the date. Your days have been numbered. Your kingdom is surely coming to an end. God numbering Babylon's kingdom speaks to its demise and its fall, and God had already prophesied this, and now that day is finally arriving. The second message on the wall, the word tekel. Verse 27, he says, Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Belshazzar, he says, has been evaluated by God. It turns personal. The first statement was about the kingdom. The kingdom is coming to an end. But God connects it specifically to the individual here, back to Belshazzar. You picture like this divine scale with God's righteousness on one side and Belshazzar on the other. And Belshazzar, you don't measure up. You're out. You're done. You've been evaluated by God. God has evaluated you. God has looked at what you've done. God has looked at who you are. He has evaluated you, and you've come up short. Your kingdom is numbered. You've been found wanting. And so the result of this, verse 28, is Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. He says your kingdom is going to fall. And specifically the suspicion that you have about the Medes and the Persians outside, he says, yeah, that's valid. That's exactly what's going to happen. Your kingdom is going to, the idea of divided doesn't necessarily mean split in half. It just means fall apart. It's been divided. If you're curious, just incidentally, about this verse says Perez, and previously it said Upharsin. The you there is a conjunction. So the message was, mene, mene, and Perez or Farson, and it was in plural there. Just like at the beginning when it was mene, mene, it's possible that plurality there on the Upharsin, making it plural, is also intensifying it, that your kingdom is certainly going to be divided. But the root word, divided, Perez, and so Daniel interprets that. He says this is what it is, which is also kind of interesting because in Aramaic, the letters that make up the word Perez, divided, are the same letters that make up the word for Persian. Kind of a play on words there. He says, yes, you are being divided, specifically by the Persians who are outside and their allies, the Medes. And so this message is certainly one of judgment. And again, notice how personal this is. You've been weighed in the balances. And because you've come up, your actions here, he says, have direct consequence. Your kingdom is falling. Your kingdom is being divided. And right in the middle of that is you. Because you have come up short. And again, to connect it back with what we saw in verse 22. You knew better. You should have known these things. Belshazzar, this proud, arrogant king, is being held personally responsible for the events that are about to take place. So you come to verse 29. It's almost kind of humorous. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. Dude, were you even listening? I mean, there's literally writing on the wall. A message that has just been explained to you. And I don't know, does he think he can get out of this? Well, maybe I can delay this. If I honor the messenger, maybe I can, do this, and maybe we can skirt this or get around it. No, not this time. The king may have followed through with his rewards, but whether he's accepting defeat and honoring Daniel or holding out hope that Daniel would be wrong or thinking that by honoring Daniel, God's spokesman, he could delay or change the outcome, none of those things are going to occur. It's probably also not likely that he believed his death was imminent. He still is holding out hope that his city defenses can withstand all of this, that surely none of this is at least going to happen anytime soon. Maybe he thinks he still has time. The next verse tells us he did not. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. Kind of interesting. One commentator said this: with only a few words, the writer of Daniel reported one of the most significant events in world history, the fall of the Babylonian Empire and the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire. This is one that we can connect in history. October 12th, 539, when the city of Babylon was conquered by the Medes and the Persians. Just kind of a reminder and a little bit of explanation, since the passage doesn't go into it. Some of the history that comes out of this tells us exactly how Babylon fell. And even if you know anything about ancient battles, this verse sounds kind of strange, that the same day Belshazzar was killed. I mean, normally battles are protracted, long events. So I just remind you of some of the things, this illustration of the city of Babylon. There were walls 17 miles long, 25 feet thick, 40 feet high, seemingly impregnable. They diverted portions of the river to create a moat around the city, so direct attack wouldn't be possible. Any of the accesses to the city through the bridges were heavily fortified. Really no way to get in or out of the city without permission. Except the Persians remembered a lesson that they had learned when the Assyrian Empire fell. The city of Nineveh had a similar situation with the Tigris River, and what they had done was they had drained the river or blocked off the river, and so when the river water fell, they could go into the city through the riverbank. And that's exactly what the Persians have been doing here. They diverted the Euphrates River into a nearby swamp, lowered the water level enough to where their soldiers could wade through in the middle of the night. They chose their time wisely because this was while the feast was going on, so the city was caught up in festivities, and they also had the benefit of Belshazzar being probably one of the least popular kings ever. Nabonidus was not a very popular king. Many of the people in the city were slaves. Remember, Nabonidus and Belshazzar both had tried to consolidate religion around singular Babylonian gods, and that didn't sit well. So these leaders are very unpopular. So once people in the city started realizing there's an invading force that's made its way in, they actually looked at the Persians as liberators. Like, sure, you can be our new bosses, come on in. And Cyrus also had a reputation. The Persian Empire was one of the few empires that had not been built upon and expanded on the backs of slaves. In fact, what Cyrus had a reputation for doing is when he conquered a territory, he tended to let captive people from previous empires return back home. And so again, the people in the city are thinking, we like this guy. And so there was really not a fight for the city. By the time people realized what was going on, it was too late. The soldiers were already in, and there was very little resistance. And so according to the histories of the time, the Persians went to the capital, or went to the palace, and Belshazzar, realizing what was happening, was about to try to kill himself, and they stopped him so that they could kill him instead. And exactly what this verse says. So this verse summarizes all that with just a very simple statement. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. Let me kind of just pause on this for a second, because I want us to kind of think about this event, what we again just read about in one single verse, the fall of the Babylonian Empire. This had come up in Scripture before in the form of prophecy. Well, let's hold your spot there in Daniel for a moment, and if you turn back to the book of Isaiah, let's just look at a couple of verses quickly. Chronologically, Isaiah written about 150 years before these events. Technically speaking, before the Babylonian captivity had even occurred. When Isaiah's writing, the big empire in the world that everybody's afraid of is the Assyrian Empire. Nobody's even thinking really about Babylon yet. And yet, notice some of these passages. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 13. Both of these chapters, if you take some time and just read through both of them, chapters 13 and 14, both describe what we call the fall of Babylon. It's a judgment that God was predicting in advance on the city of Babylon and the nation of Babylon. And if you look at chapter 13, verse 17, it says, "Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, which shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it." I mean, calls them out by name. The empire, again, everybody's worried about the Assyrians. The Babylonians were next. The Medes and the Persians weren't even a blip on the radar. And God says, though, Babylon will fall to this group, to the Medes and the Persians. Turn over a page to chapter 14. We looked at some of this passage earlier when we were talking about angels, because God uses the events of this passage to give us kind of an illustration, a reminder, a foreshadowing, if you will, or post-shadowing, of Satan's fall. But the specific reference in this passage is the king of Babylon. We just read about it. His name's Belshazzar. And notice some of the statements made about this king. Look at chapter 14, picking up at verse 4. It says that thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, How hath the oppressor ceased, and the golden city ceased? The Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruleth the nations in anger is persecuted, and none hindereth. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. Yea, the fir trees rejoice at thee. The cedars of Lebanon saying, Since thou art laid up, no fellow is come against us. Hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up their thrones to the kings of the nations. All they shall speak and say unto thee, Art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy vials, the worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the earth? Thou didst weaken the nations. For thou hast said in thine heart, now think about the pride and the arrogancy of this king, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit upon the mounts of the congregation of the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yea, thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, Is this the man that made the earth to tremble, and did shake kingdoms, that made the world as a wilderness, and destroyed the cities thereof, and opened not the house of the prisoners? You can go on and read through the rest of the chapter and see again continued rebukes against this king for his arrogant pride, that God brought him down to humility. God judged him. And again, we do see in this a reference to the fall ultimately of the one behind the king of Babylon. This goes beyond him. There are some descriptions here. There's a connection here with Satan himself. But God had predicted this proud, arrogant king who thought he was everything will be brought down to nothing. Let me show you just one or two more. Turn over to Isaiah chapter 44. Another prophecy that Isaiah made against the nation of Babylon. And if you look at the very end of chapter 44 and leading into chapter 45, this is a continuous message, remembering that Cyrus is the king of the Persians that is conquering the city of Babylon. Verse 28, 150 years previously, that said of, calling him out by name, Cyrus, he is my shepherd, he shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, that I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. God said, I'm going to give this king Cyrus the opportunity to raise up a nation, conquer kingdoms, and he's going to accomplish my purposes, my will. We'll follow this trajectory through. It's going to be this king that is going to issue a proclamation that allows the Jews to return home to their homeland after the captivity. Cyrus is going to do what Cyrus has a reputation for doing. He's going to release captives. Remember that when we get to later chapters like chapter 9, and we're going to see some anticipation of some of these things. But the point is, God was calling this out in advance. If you needed any other evidence of God ruling in the affairs of men, he's already planned who the king 150 years in the previous is going to be, and he's going to accomplish his will through that king. We don't have any evidence that Cyrus knows the Lord, that he's doing what he's doing because he's devoted to Jehovah. But the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. He, like the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. God accomplishes his will in the affairs of men. And all of this that we just read about in Daniel chapter 5, God had spoken of previously. You go over to chapter 47, you'll see another description of the fall of Babylon. We're not going to turn to that one, but it describes how rapidly Babylon falls. It says, in a single night she shall fall. It's exactly what we just read about in Daniel. So back to Daniel chapter 5, verse 31 ends this description, this narrative, by saying, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. We'll get to chapter 6. We'll talk about Darius and his relationship and connection with Cyrus. We'll connect those dots. But the point is that God's statement about Babylon's fall has come to pass. God's word is true. Let me just summarize as we wrap up chapter 5, though, just a few takeaways. We did a few of these last week to just some lessons already learned from the first half of the chapter, but now as we look at the chapter as a whole, what are some things we can remember, some lessons to take? First of all, as always, and we've seen this in pretty much every chapter so far, whether it was God giving Israel and Judah over to the Babylonians in the first place, God telling Nebuchadnezzar, I've got a succession of kingdoms planned that's going to culminate in my kingdom being established. Chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar thought he could stop that plan and resist that plan, and God says, no, I'm all powerful even if my people are in captivity because I'm using this for a purpose. Chapter 4, God had to humble Nebuchadnezzar and say, look, I'm in charge here, not you. And chapter 5, we see the same lesson again. God rules in the affairs of men. And I hope that resounding theme that keeps coming up chapter by chapter by chapter just gets embedded into our hearts so that we don't get fretful every time we watch the news. You don't have to be afraid every time you see the latest goings on, whether it's here or Washington or across the world. God's in charge. We do what we're called to do. We do what God's asked us to do, and we trust Him that He's running the show. It's not up to us. It's up to us to be faithful. It's up to us to do what God's asked us to do, to fulfill our responsibilities, to accomplish the objectives that He's given us to do, and trust Him to coordinate it all and to work His will and His plan and His purposes. One big takeaway you take away from the book of Daniel is just to go, because there's a God in heaven, and He rules in the affairs of men. And because God is going to accomplish His purposes, our pride serves no purpose. We don't get credit for it. We're not trying to divert attention to ourselves. It's not about us. It's about Him. And as you think back on chapter 5, I want you to remember Belshazzar and his arrogant pride, thinking he can make this all about him. Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. This chapter is a perfect illustration of that proverb. Now, the problem with pride is that we're the last ones to know we have it. So just purposefully focus on humility. Deflect praise. Deflect credit. Always look to God. Don't make it about you. When your feelings get hurt over something like, well, that person didn't appreciate me, that's pride. Well, I didn't get to, that's pride. Start learning the symptoms of it so that you can recognize it more clearly. Don't sit in services and say, boy, that was a good sermon for so-and-so. God put you in that service. What are you supposed to take away from it? It's not about anything other than God. So beware of pride. Another lesson to learn from chapter 5 is to learn from the past. I've mentioned this before, but it's been said there's two ways to learn. You can learn from personal experience and you can learn from the experience of others. Hurts a lot less to learn from the experience of others. Belshazzar had paid attention to what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Who knows how this story goes differently? God's word would still be true, but may not have been him. He had an opportunity. God was teaching him. God was showing him. He just needed to learn it. What sins are we committing today that we know better? Don't be surprised at the consequences of sin. Don't get caught off guard. You go into it knowing you're sinning. You didn't learn. And then this reminder that goes along with that. There does seem to be a pattern in Scripture that God does distinguish in consequences between people who do things out of ignorance and people who do things purposefully. It's wrong either way. And if you go back and look at the sacrifices of the Old Testament, there were sins that they could, or there were sacrifices that they could make for sins of ignorance. and there's mercy and there's grace for those things. But God did seem to hold greater consequences to those who knew what they were doing. In fact, there's a reference to that these high-handed sins had no sacrifice that was to be made for them. I think David reflects that a little bit when after his sin with Bathsheba, he says, if thou desire sacrifice, I would offer it. He said that there's no sacrifice you want. David knew his sin was high-handed. He knew his sin. He could do nothing but throw himself on the mercy of God. And boy, did that sin have consequences. So again, if number 2 and number 3 aren't enough to keep you on the straight and narrow, remember number 4. When you know better, and when in pride you sin anyway, please don't be surprised when those consequences seem great. Seems to be the way it is. God cares enough about you to discourage you from sinning, and He will do whatever means necessary to correct it. Then another takeaway from chapter 5 is that God always keeps His promises. God had made promises to Babylon 150 years previous. God had told Nebuchadnezzar exactly how this was going to play out. God kept His promises. God's also faithful to Daniel. God's kept His promises to Daniel. Daniel's been faithful, and God is still using him, giving him opportunity to serve. It's a good reminder for each of us that regardless of what we perceive happening around us, that God is not unfaithful. God always keeps His promises. Let me give you a couple of announcements here as we wrap things up. First of all, I think most of you are aware of this, but we are headed into a brief hiatus this time of year. Each year, Campus Church takes a break from not church, but from Bible studies. There's a lot of vacations, a lot of things going on, and so the next 6 weeks, we will not have Bible study. So we resume again in July. And you can see the church calendar. And again, still come to church. There'll still be church services for all of that. But I think down in the lobbies, there are booklets for like basically home Bible studies. If you want to have family or get together as a group yourself to continue Bible studies, we'll put our Daniel series on hold and we'll just resume this later this summer. But just so you're aware, if you show up next week looking for breakfast at 9 o'clock, you're going to be hungry. So stop and get breakfast on your way to Sunday school. Second thing I want to remind you of is to be aware of over the next 6 weeks and to start collecting for. I mentioned this to you last week. What we want to do in mid to late July is be able to be a blessing to our first responders. So we're going to collect some food items, non-perishables, things that they can use for snacks or for heat up meals and things. We're going to have these boxes up here. There's already some up here that have been brought in. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, just when you're at the store, if there's a BOGO, get one for you and get one for the box. And just set them aside. We'll also, on the Facebook, and I'll send it out through Realm, we'll put together basically a wish list of items, like, for example, from Amazon. So if that's easier for you, and if nothing else, it may give you some ideas of some things to look for. But over the course of the next 6 weeks, just collect things. And then when we do meet again in July, just bring those with you. The first 2 weeks that we're back in July, we're going to take those weeks to kind of organize and to put some notes together to put with these items. And then by the end of July, we'll fix up boxes and packages and take them to various locations, police stations, firehouses, first responders in our area. So this is a great way for us to give back, to be a witness and a testimony in our community. So just kind of keep that on your radar. And like I said, throughout the 6 weeks, I will send out periodic reminders just so it stays with you there. And we'll look forward to doing that when we come back. Am I missing anything? All right, I think we're good. Well, I will see you back here in 6 weeks, and I'll see you in church sooner than that.